Before kings ruled the Aegean, before armies carved borders into stone, an island civilization shaped the ancient world through the sea. They built palaces without walls, ruled without crowns, and left behind a language that still refuses to speak. From Crete's first settlers to its myths of Atlantis and disappearance, this is the story of a civilization that flowed rather than conquered. If you enjoy deep history, subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. The island between worlds, where the Minoans first emerged, before there were palaces, before painted walls and storerooms filled with oil and grain, before names were carved into memory and myth, there was only an island resting between larger worlds, shaped slowly by wind, stone and salt. An island that did not rush to become anything more than it was. This island was Crete. It lay stretched across the southern edge of the Aegean like a long uneven bridge that never quite connected anywhere. To the north shimmered the broken waters of the Aegean Sea, scattered with islands that appeared and vanished with the haze. To the south opened a deeper, darker expanse of the Mediterranean Sea, vast and patient, leading toward Africa and lands beyond the horizon. Crete was close enough to many worlds to sense them, but far enough from all of them to remain its own. That distance would matter. It would shape not only how people lived, but how they thought, moved, and imagined themselves in relation to the wider world. The island itself was not gentle. From the sea, its coastline rose abruptly, often in cliffs and jagged slopes that left little room for easy landing. Inland, mountains dominated almost everything. Ridges ran east to west, like a spine, breaking the land into compartments. Valleys opened briefly, then closed again. Plains existed, but only in pockets, surrounded by higher ground that hemmed them in. To move across Crete on foot was slow, exhausting work. Paths twisted through gorges and over high passes where weather could change without warning. One valley might enjoy sunlight, while the next sat under cloud and wind. Snow settled on the peaks even as olives ripened near the shore below. For early inhabitants, this meant that no single place could easily control the rest. Communities formed where the land allowed it, often separated from one another not by distance, but by difficulty. Crete was an island, but it was also many small worlds folded together. And yet, for all its ruggedness, Crete was never closed. The sea was always there, pressing gently against the shore, repeating itself day after day. It carried fish, driftwood, and the occasional reminder that other lands existed beyond the line where water met sky. On clear days, distant islands appeared like ghosts, hovering just above the horizon. They were close enough to see, far enough to demand effort. From the very beginning, reaching Crete required intention. Unlike many other places settled in deep antiquity, Crete was never connected to the mainland by land bridges. Even during the coldest periods of the Ice Age, when sea levels fell dramatically, the island remained separated by water. Anyone who came here did so by boat. This single fact quietly set the course of everything that followed. The earliest traces of humans on Crete are faint. Stone tools scattered along ancient shorelines, hints rather than narratives. They suggest visits, experiments, perhaps seasonal landings by people testing the limits of their world. These were not mass migrations. They were cautious steps. True settlement came much later, when Neolithic farmers arrived carrying animals, seeds, and a way of life that depended on planning ahead. Every sheep, every goat, every grain of barley had to be ferried across open water. There were no second chances if supplies were lost to storms or miscalculation. From the first permanent villages onward, survival on Crete demanded maritime skill. Boats were not luxuries or symbols of status, they were necessities. Without them, there was no island life at all. Once settled, The land imposed its own lessons. Crete could be generous, but only if treated carefully. Rain came mostly in winter, often heavy but short-lived. Summers were long and dry, hardening the soil and draining shallow streams. Rivers rarely flowed year-round. Springs existed, but they were unevenly spread, known only to those who had learned the land well. Large-scale grain farming, like that seen in river valleys elsewhere, was difficult. The plains could support fields, but they were limited in size. Overuse could ruin them quickly. Herding became essential, especially of animals that could survive on sparse vegetation and steep terrain. Goats and sheep thrived where cattle struggled. Olive trees took root slowly, but once established they endured drought and poor soil. Vines followed, clinging to slopes where little else would grow. These crops did not produce instant abundance. They required patience, long-term thinking, and care across generations. Life on Crete rewarded restraint. Communities learned not to extract everything the land could give at once. Storage mattered. Repair mattered. Knowing when not to plant mattered just as much as knowing when to harvest. The island trained its people to think in cycles rather than surges. This environment did not encourage sudden population explosions or aggressive expansion. Instead, it favoured stability. Villages persisted in the same locations for centuries, adjusting slowly to changes in climate, technique, and trade. The mountains reinforced this stability. They made rapid overland movement difficult, which in turn limited the ability of any one group to dominate others by force. Power, when it existed, remained local and negotiated. Cooperation was not idealistic, it was practical. If the land shaped caution, the sea shaped curiosity. Compared to the slow, demanding routes across mountains, the sea offered efficiency. Once boats became reliable, travel along the coast and between islands was faster than walking inland. Harbours and coves became natural meeting points, places where goods and stories arrived together. Fishing was only the beginning. Shells, obsidian, metals, and ideas began to move quietly across water. Crete's position placed it near emerging sea routes linking mainland Greece, Anatolia, and eventually regions farther south and east. Ships did not need to conquer to matter, they needed only to arrive. This changed how isolation functioned. Crete was protected from sudden invasions. Large armies could not simply appear. Any hostile force would need ships, logistics, and determination. The island gained time to grow without constant disruption. At the same moment it remained open to influence. Traders could come and go. Techniques could be borrowed. Styles could be adapted. Crete became a listener as much as a speaker, absorbing without losing itself. This balance, protected yet permeable, was rare. Over centuries, it shaped a society that was outward-facing without being aggressive, connected without being dominated. The sea did not erase isolation, it refined it. Seasons passed, and with them came rhythms that settled deep into daily life. Winter rains softened the land, spring brought brief abundance, summer demanded endurance, autumn called for careful harvesting and storage. Time moved slowly but not aimlessly. Villages grew modestly, tools improved, pottery styles shifted almost imperceptibly from generation to generation. Boats became more capable, extending range a little further with each era. Contacts multiplied, but rarely overwhelmed. There was no single founding moment, no dramatic beginning. Civilization on Crete accumulated rather than erupted. By the early Bronze Age, the island had changed. Settlements clustered near fertile plains and safe anchorages. Craft specialization appeared. Potters, metalworkers, builders refining their skills. Exchange networks extended beyond the horizon. Yet even now, authority remained diffuse. There were leaders, elders, perhaps ritual figures, but no towering monuments proclaiming dominance, no walls slicing landscapes into territories. The land itself resisted that kind of simplicity. Crete had taught its people to live within limits, to move across water rather than over others, to value continuity over conquest, long before frescoes, captured motion and colour, long before storerooms recorded surplus. The foundations were already set, not in stone blocks, but in habits shaped by geography. The island did not push its people toward empire, it pushed them toward balance. When later generations would look back, they would see only the visible remains, palaces, art, myths. They would imagine sudden brilliance, lost kings, vanished power. But beneath all of that lay a quieter truth. The Minoan world was not created by ambition alone. It was shaped by an island that demanded patience, adaptability, and respect for forces larger than any single community. Crete did not promise easy survival. It offered something slower and more enduring, the chance to become distinct. And in the long silence before history began to speak clearly, that was enough. Before the palaces, early settlers, and Bronze Age beginnings, long before stone corridors echoed with footsteps, before painted walls caught light and movement, before storage rooms quietly counted the wealth of harvests and trade, life on Crete unfolded at a slower, humbler scale. This was a time without palaces, not because the people lacked skill or imagination, but because the island itself had not yet finished teaching them how to live upon it. The earliest permanent settlers arrived carrying more than tools and animals. They carried memory, knowledge learned elsewhere, tested again in a place that offered no guarantees. Crete did not welcome them with wide plains or predictable rivers. It demanded adjustment from the very first season. Villages formed cautiously. They were placed where water could be found reliably, where soil could be coaxed into producing food, and where slopes provided shelter from wind without cutting people off entirely. These settlements were small, often little more than clusters of simple structures built from stone, mud brick, and timber. Nothing about them suggested permanence at first glance, yet many endured. Fields were cleared slowly. Forests were not erased in great sweeps, but thinned selectively. Early farmers planted grains they already knew, barley, wheat, while learning quickly which crops failed under Cretan conditions. Herds were kept close, moved carefully between grazing areas to avoid stripping the land bare. This was farming shaped by caution. The island offered lessons season by season. Rainfall could be generous one winter and absent the next. Soil that seemed fertile one year might exhaust itself if pushed too hard. Communities that survived learned to spread risk, combining farming with herding, gathering, and fishing, rather than relying on a single source of food. Food security did not come from abundance. It came from diversity. Villages were rarely isolated entirely. Paths connected nearby settlements, winding through valleys and along ridges. These routes were not roads in the later sense, but shared understandings of how to move across difficult land. People visited one another, exchanged goods, partners, and stories. No village was fully self-sufficient. Cooperation was built into survival. Over generations, these connections thickened into networks. Pottery styles began to resemble one another across regions. Stone tools followed familiar patterns. Burial customs hinted at shared beliefs, even when communities were separated by mountains. At the same time, differences persisted. Crete's geography encouraged regional character. Western villages adapted differently than those in the central plains or the east. Isolation was never complete, but neither was uniformity. This balance, shared culture without total sameness, became a quiet foundation of later Minoan society. As villages stabilized, technology improved gradually. Pottery became more refined, fired more evenly, shaped with increasing confidence. Storage vessels grew larger, signalling the ability to plan beyond immediate needs. Tools were repaired rather than discarded, suggesting an understanding of value measured in longevity. Metal appeared slowly. Early copper objects were rare and precious, likely imported at first. They did not replace stone overnight. Instead, they coexisted, marking status or special function rather than everyday necessity. Nothing arrived suddenly. Everything layered. The sea remained ever present. At first, boats hugged the coastline. Simple craft ventured out only when conditions were favourable, carrying fish, shells, and small cargo. Over time, confidence grew. Mariners learned the rhythms of wind and current, the signs of changing weather, the safe distances between headlands. Short journeys lengthened. Contact with nearby islands increased. Obsidian, prized for its sharpness, moved across water routes. Ideas travelled with it. Techniques, designs, perhaps even songs, and rituals shared during brief meetings on beaches and in sheltered coves. Seafaring did not replace land-based life. It complemented it. Villages near the coast became intermediaries, linking inland communities to the wider world. Goods flowed inward and outward, creating early economic roles without centralized control. A settlement's importance depended less on size than on position. This decentralization mattered. Without a dominant center, power remained distributed. Leadership likely rested with elders, skilled individuals, or ritual specialists rather than hereditary rulers. Authority came from experience and trust, not monuments. This was not a world without hierarchy, but it was one without sharp edges. As centuries passed and the Bronze Age approached, subtle changes accumulated. Population increased modestly. Settlements expanded, sometimes merging with neighbouring hamlets. Houses became more durable, built with greater care and planning. Storage grew more sophisticated. Surplus could now be held across seasons, cushioning bad years. With surplus came new possibilities, specialisation, exchange, experimentation. Crafts diversified. Some individuals focused on pottery, others on weaving, metalwork, or boat building. Skill deepened through repetition. Objects became not only functional, but expressive. Decoration appeared not as excess, but as identity. Burial practices evolved as well. Graves grew more elaborate in some regions, suggesting emerging distinctions in status or role. Yet even here, extremes were rare. Wealth, when displayed, was modest and contextual rather than overwhelming. The island still resisted concentration. The sea routes extended farther. Crete's position placed it naturally along paths linking the Aegean to the eastern Mediterranean. Mariners encountered foreign goods, metals, stone, styles unlike their own. Some of these influences were adopted, others quietly ignored. Crete learned to select. This selective openness would later become a defining trait. The island absorbed what fit its rhythms and filtered out what did not. By the late early Bronze Age, Crete had crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer simply a collection of villages. It was a networked society with shared practices, expanding contacts, and increasing confidence in its ability to sustain itself. Yet still, no palaces rose. Instead, communal spaces grew gradually. Larger gathering areas, shared storage facilities, places where decisions could be made collectively. These were not symbols of domination, but of coordination. The foundations of later complexity were being laid quietly. People now lived with a deeper sense of continuity. Knowledge passed not just from parent to child, but across generations through habit and tradition. The land was no longer an adversary to be tested, but a partner to be managed. Crete had taught its settlers how to stay. This long period before palaces was not an age of waiting. It was an age of preparation, though no one living through it would have recognized it as such. They were not building toward grandeur, they were building toward stability. When palaces eventually appeared, they would not represent a sudden break from the past. They would be expansions of systems already in place, storage made larger, coordination made more visible, authority given architectural form. But all of that rested on centuries of village life, on fields planted and replanted, on boats launched and repaired, on decisions made collectively in the absence of kings. The Bronze Age did not arrive in Crete as a revolution, it arrived as a deepening, and by the time the first great structures began to rise, the island had already learned who it was and what it required to endure. The first palaces, Knossos, and the birth of Minoan power. The change did not announce itself with fanfare. There was no single year when Crete awoke to find itself transformed. No trumpet call, no conquering army, no royal decree carved into stone. Instead, the shift arrived quietly, carried forward by habits that had been forming for centuries. Villages had grown larger, networks had thickened, storage had expanded, skills had deepened, people were already producing more than they immediately needed, already moving goods across regions, already trusting certain places as gathering points. What changed was scale. On the north-central coast of Crete, near fertile land and a protected shoreline, one settlement began to draw more people, more goods, more attention than the others. Not because it declared itself superior, but because it sat at the crossroads of existing systems. This place would later be known as Knossos. At first there was nothing extraordinary about it. It was a settlement like many others. Houses clustered near fields, paths leading inland, boats pulled up along the shore. But over time, Knossos became a place where things accumulated. Grain, oil, wool, pottery, tools, information. People came here not to submit, but to participate. As agricultural production increased in the surrounding region, storage became more important than ever. Surplus had to be protected from pests, moisture, and theft. It had to be counted, redistributed, and remembered. Doing this at the level of individual households was inefficient. Doing it collectively made sense. Structures grew larger to meet this need. At first, these buildings were practical. Long rooms for storage, courtyards for sorting and gathering, workspaces for processing goods. Nothing about them suggested grandeur. They were utilitarian, built to solve problems rather than inspire awe. But utility has a way of becoming authority. When food, tools and raw materials pass regularly through the same hands, those hands gain influence. When decisions about distribution are made in one place, that place begins to matter more than others, not through force, but through dependence. Knossos began to centralize activity long before it centralized power. As buildings expanded and were rebuilt again and again, their layout became increasingly complex. Corridors connected rooms at odd angles, staircases linked multiple levels, courtyards opened unexpectedly, letting light spill into interior spaces. This was not the architecture of rigid planning. It was organic, adaptive, layered over time. Each generation added, modified, repaired, walls shifted, functions changed. Nothing was frozen. The result was a structure that felt alive, confusing to outsiders, intuitive to those who worked within it daily. There were no massive fortification walls surrounding Knossos, no battlements looming over the countryside. This absence is striking, especially when compared to later mainland centres that had bristled with defences. Knossos did not present itself as a fortress. Its power, in this early phase, did not rely on intimidation. It relied on coordination. Storerooms lined with massive ceramic jars, pithoi, held oil, grain, and other staples. These were not the possessions of a single ruler. They were communal resources, drawn from the surrounding region and redistributed as needed. Record keeping emerged to support this system. Symbols were impressed into clay. Tallies were made. Goods were counted not as abstract wealth, but as practical necessities tied to survival and continuity. Authority here was administrative before it was political. Those who managed these systems gained prestige. They became specialists, not warriors or kings, but organisers. Their influence came from knowledge, knowing how much was stored, where it came from, when it would be needed. Power became quieter, less visible. Architecture reinforced this subtle authority. The palace complex did not overwhelm visitors with scale alone. Instead, it guided them. Pathways narrowed, then widened. Light and shadow shifted. Movement was controlled without force. To enter Knossos was to be oriented gently but firmly into a system larger than oneself. The central courtyard became the heart of this system. Open to the sky, it functioned as a gathering space, a ritual arena, a place where the community could assemble. Activities here blurred the line between economic, social, and sacred life. Work and ritual were not separate spheres. They were intertwined. Art began to appear on walls, not as propaganda, but as expression. Frescoes depicted movement, nature, animals, and people in motion. They celebrated life rather than conquest. There were no scenes of enemies crushed beneath feet, no kings towering over subjects. This absence is as meaningful as any presence. Knossos did not project power through domination. It projected coherence. As the palace grew, so did its reach, surrounding. Settlements began to align their production with its needs, not because they were forced to, but because participation brought benefits. Access to stored goods during lean years, opportunities for exchange, inclusion in wider networks. This created a feedback loop. The more people relied on Knossos, the more central it became. The more central it became, the more its systems expanded. Yet this expansion was gradual. There was no sudden break between village life and palace life. Many people who worked within the palace still lived in nearby communities, tending fields, herding animals, fishing, and crafting. The palace was not a world apart. It was an extension of the village world, scaled up. Authority during this period remained collective rather than singular. There is little evidence for an early Minoan king in the traditional sense. No thrones, no royal tombs dominating the landscape. Leadership was likely distributed among elites, administrators, ritual leaders, skilled organisers, whose power depended on cooperation rather than command. This may explain the palace's openness, multiple entrances, flowing spaces, few barriers. Power was present, but it was permeable. Knossos also benefited from its position relative to the sea. Goods arriving by boat could be processed, stored, and redirected inland. Materials from the interior could be gathered and prepared for export. The palace became an interface between land and water, between local production and wider exchange. Over time, this role intensified. Knossos was no longer simply a large settlement. It was becoming a hub. With scale came vulnerability. Fire, earthquakes, and wear required constant rebuilding. The palace did not endure unchanged. It was destroyed and reconstructed multiple times, each phase layering new solutions over old foundations. Rather than abandoning the site after destruction, the people rebuilt, again and again. This persistence speaks volumes. Knossos mattered too much to let go. Each rebuilding allowed refinement. Storage became more efficient. Movement became more controlled. Spaces were adapted to emerging needs. The palace grew not just larger, but smarter, and with intelligence came confidence. Knossos began to influence not only economics, but identity. Styles developed here spread outward. Practices standardized. The rhythms of palace life began to shape the rhythms of the island. Yet even now, power remained unusually restrained. There were no monumental statues of rulers, no inscriptions boasting of victories, no evidence of a standing army housed within palace walls. Knossos did not rule by fear. Its authority rested on the simple fact that it worked. It fed people. It organized labor. It connected regions. It endured disasters. In a landscape shaped by uncertainty, that reliability became a form of power more compelling than force. The first palaces of Crete were not expressions of domination. They were solutions, architectural answers to social complexity. Knossos stands at the beginning of this transformation, not because it invented power, but because it gathered it, shaped it, and made it visible. What emerged here was something new, a centralized system without obvious kingship, authority without tyranny, complexity without collapse. The island had spent centuries preparing for this moment, learning restraint, cooperation, and adaptation. The palace was not a rejection of that past, it was its culmination, and as Knossos rose, quietly and persistently, the Minoan world took its first unmistakable step into history. Palace without kings? A different kind of rule. Power on Crete did not announce itself the way power did elsewhere in the ancient world. There were no crowned figures carved in stone, no long lists of conquered enemies, no walls rising high to warn outsiders where authority began and ended. If someone had arrived on the island expecting to find kings seated on thrones, issuing commands backed by force, they would have left confused. And yet, Crete was not without order. By the time the first palaces had fully taken shape, the island was clearly organised. Resources moved predictably. Labour was coordinated across regions. Building projects unfolded over generations. Trade flowed outward and inward with remarkable consistency. Decisions were being made, enforced, and remembered. The absence of visible kings did not mean the absence of power. It meant power had taken a different form. Authority on Crete emerged not from conquest, but from management. The palaces, especially places like Knossos, did not function as royal residences in the later sense. They were not private spaces set apart from the population. They were administrative organisms designed to absorb, process, and redistribute the lifeblood of society. Grain, oil, wool, metal, pottery, these moved into palace complexes from the surrounding countryside in steady streams. Farmers brought portions of their harvest. Herders contributed wool and livestock products. Artisans delivered finished goods or raw materials. None of this suggests taxation enforced by soldiers at spear point. Instead, it points to obligation embedded in participation. To be part of the system was to contribute to it. In return, the palace provided security against uncertainty. Stored food buffered poor harvests. Materials were redistributed for construction, ritual, and trade. Labour was organised for projects no single village could accomplish alone. This was not equality, but it was reciprocity. At the centre of this system stood a class of elites whose power came from proximity to administration rather than bloodline monarchy. These were people who understood measurement, timing, storage, and coordination. They knew how much was available, where it was kept, and when it would be needed. Knowledge became authority. The palace amplified this knowledge through architecture. Storerooms were vast and orderly, lined with massive jars embedded into floors. Their arrangement was deliberate, allowing quantities to be tracked visually. Corridors funneled movement. Workspaces were positioned near storage areas to minimize waste and confusion. Everything about the palace suggested oversight without spectacle. Administration required memory, and memory required systems. Clay tablets were impressed with symbols now known as linear A. Though undeciphered, their purpose is clear enough. They recorded transactions, inventories, and obligations. They were not literature, they were tools. Writing did not serve glory, it served control. Seal stones added another layer. Individuals carried carved seals, pressing unique designs into clay to mark goods or documents. Identity, in this world, was functional. A seal did not proclaim who you were in mythic terms. It identified your role within the system. Authority could be traced, not dramatized. What is striking is how impersonal this power appears. There is no clear evidence that decisions were tied to a single exalted figure. Instead, authority seems to have been distributed among groups. Administrators, ritual leaders, senior artisans, each responsible for different aspects of palace life. Power was collaborative, but not diffuse. Those who controlled redistribution held leverage. They could prioritize certain regions, workshops, or projects. They could decide which goods were allocated where and when. These decisions shaped livelihoods, opportunities, and influence, and yet they were constrained by the system itself. Mismanagement would be visible quickly, storerooms emptying too fast, shortages appearing, labour faltering. Authority had to be maintained through competence. This created a form of rule based on performance rather than intimidation. The absence of overt kingship may also reflect the island's geography and history. Crete had grown accustomed to decentralised life. Valleys and regions had long managed their own affairs. A sudden imposition of absolute rule would have clashed with deeply ingrained habits. Instead, palatial authority grew by invitation. Communities aligned themselves with palaces because it made sense. Participation brought access, stability, and prestige. Over time, this alignment became normalized, embedded into everyday life. Ritual reinforced this order. Palaces were not just economic centers, they were ceremonial ones. Courtyards hosted gatherings where the community could see itself reflected back through shared practices. Religious activities did not stand apart from administration. Offerings, festivals, and processions tied spiritual meaning to economic flows. To give to the palace was not merely practical, it was sacred. This blending of ritual and redistribution strengthened legitimacy. Authority did not need to justify itself through force. It was sanctified through repetition and belief. Art echoed this worldview. Frescoes showed movement, balance, and participation rather than hierarchy. Figures interacted with animals, landscapes, and one another without rigid ranking. Even when individuals were emphasized, they were part of a scene, not elevated above it. Power was present, but it was woven into the fabric rather than perched above it. This does not mean inequality did not exist. Some lived closer to the palace, worked within it, or had access to imported goods and specialized knowledge. Elites enjoyed comforts unavailable to most, but the differences were muted compared to other Bronze Age societies. No tombs loomed larger than life. No monuments screamed permanence. The system seemed designed to endure by avoiding extremes. Administration also extended outward. Secondary centres mirrored aspects of palace organisation, creating a network rather than a single point of control. Goods flowed toward palaces and outward again along predictable routes. Information moved with them. Crete became coordinated without becoming rigid. This flexibility may explain its resilience. When disasters struck, earthquakes, fires, the system bent rather than shattered. Palaces were rebuilt, sometimes altered, but not abandoned. Authority reconstituted itself because it was not tied to a single individual. No king died to bring everything down. The phrase, "palace without kings," is not an absence. It is a description of a different political imagination, one where power was exercised through systems, not spectacle, where authority rested on continuity, not charisma. Crete did not invent administration, but it refined it in a way uniquely suited to an island that valued balance over domination. By choosing coordination over coercion, the Minoan world created a form of rule that was subtle, durable, and deeply embedded in daily life. It did not need to announce itself. It was already everywhere, measured in jars, sealed in clay, walked through in corridors worn smooth by generations of use. This was power that whispered rather than shouted, and for centuries it worked. The sea was their empire, trade, ships, and thalassocracy. The sea did not belong to the Minoans because they conquered it. It belonged to them because they learned how to live inside it. Long before the word empire could be spoken in stone or law, long before banners or borders, the people of Crete had already accepted a quieter truth, that their island would never dominate by land. The mountains resisted unity, the valleys resisted control, but the water, open, shifting, endlessly connective, offered something else entirely. From the earliest generations, the sea had been a condition of existence. Crete had never been reached by accident. Every arrival, every departure required intention, skill, and trust in fragile craft moving across an unpredictable surface. Over centuries, that necessity became familiarity, familiarity became confidence, confidence became reach. By the time palaces were quietly coordinating the island's resources, the sea was no longer a boundary, it was infrastructure. Along Crete's northern coast, harbours formed where the land bent inward, offering protection from prevailing winds. These were not monumental ports carved from stone. They were practical places, beaches, coves, sheltered inlets, where boats could be pulled ashore, repaired, loaded, and launched again. Over time, paths connected these harbours to inland settlements and palatial centres, binding land and sea into a single system. The ships themselves evolved slowly. Early boats were small, hugging coastlines, venturing out only when conditions were favourable. They were built from local timber, stitched and sealed, light enough to be dragged ashore. They carried people first, then modest cargo, stone, pottery, dried food, fibres. What mattered was not size, but reliability. Sailors learned to read the Aegean. They memorized currents, seasonal winds, the colour of water before a storm, the behaviour of clouds at certain hours. Knowledge passed orally, embedded in practice rather than record. Each successful voyage expanded the mental map of the sea. Gradually, distances shortened, not physically, but psychologically. Islands that once felt remote became familiar stops. Routes stabilised. Voyages grew routine. What had been risk became rhythm. Crete's position was ideal, though not obviously so. It sat between mainland Greece and Anatolia, between the Cyclades and the open Mediterranean, between Europe and Africa. Ships moving along these paths could not ignore it. They could avoid it, but stopping was easier. Crete became a place of encounter. Goods arrived quietly. Obsidian from volcanic islands, metals from distant sources, stone types not found on Crete, styles of pottery, tools, and ornaments that hinted at other worlds. None of these overwhelmed local traditions. Instead, they were absorbed, adapted, and redistributed. The Minoans did not merely trade, they curated. Exports followed the same routes outward: olive oil, wine, textiles, crafted goods, items that benefited from skill, patience, and refinement rather than sheer volume. These were not bulk commodities meant to flood markets. They were high-value goods, recognizable and desirable. Minoan pottery began to appear far from Crete. Its shapes, finishes, and decorative styles were distinctive enough to be identified immediately. This was not accidental. Consistency signalled reliability. Reliability built reputation. Reputation became power. Unlike later empires, Minoan influence did not arrive with soldiers or demands. It arrived with familiarity. Ports that regularly received Cretan ships came to expect them. Local elites grew accustomed to Minoan goods, styles, and practices. Over time, alignment with Crete brought prestige. This is the essence of thalassocracy, not rule through force, but through presence. The sea allowed Crete to project influence without occupying territory. There were no distant colonies ruled directly from the island, no garrisons enforcing obedience. Instead, there were relationships, commercial, cultural, ritual, maintained by movement. Ships were the messengers of this system. They carried more than cargo. They carried people who spoke multiple dialects, who understood foreign customs, who could negotiate, observe, and adapt. These sailors were not conquerors. They were intermediaries. In many ports, Minoans likely lived temporarily or permanently, forming small communities that blended in rather than stood apart. Their influence spread through imitation rather than decree. Art reflects this worldview. Minoan imagery rarely glorifies naval warfare. Ships appear as part of life, not instruments of domination. The sea is shown as dynamic, alive, something to move within rather than master. Even when myths later remembered Crete as powerful, they remembered it as skilled. The idea that the Minoans controlled the sea so thoroughly that they did not need walls or armies may be exaggerated, but it reflects a real perception. Their strength lay in connectivity. Disrupting them meant disrupting networks, an expensive and uncertain endeavour. Soft power has resilience. Trade routes extended southward toward Egypt and the Levant. Minoan goods appear in contexts far from the Aegean, suggesting sustained contact rather than isolated exchange. These connections likely flowed both ways. Crete received exotic materials, ideas, and techniques that enriched its own culture without displacing it. The palaces played a central role in managing this maritime system. They organised production for export, stored incoming goods, and coordinated labour tied to shipbuilding and repair. They were not naval headquarters in the later sense, but logistical brains. Administration followed the sea. The lack of fortifications at many Minoan centres may reflect confidence in this system. Threats were managed before they arrived. Diplomacy, trade, and reputation acted as buffers. Why attack a partner who enriched you? Why disrupt a network that benefited all involved? This does not mean the sea was peaceful. Storms, piracy, accidents, all were real. But the Minoan response was not militarization, it was redundancy. Multiple routes, multiple partners, flexibility. If one connection failed, others remained. Over generations, this maritime orientation reshaped identity. The Minoans did not see themselves as isolated islanders. They saw themselves as participants in a wider world, defined by movement rather than borders. Children grew up hearing stories of distant lands. Craftspeople worked with materials whose origins lay beyond the horizon. Rituals incorporated symbols that echoed foreign influences, transformed into something distinctly Cretan. The sea blurred distinctions. This constant exchange also influenced political culture. A society dependent on trade cannot afford rigid hierarchy or inflexibility. Negotiation, trust, and adaptability become survival skills. Authority must be credible, not absolute. The palace system reflected this. It coordinated without stifling. It standardized without erasing local variation. It enabled trade without monopolizing it entirely. Crete's maritime dominance was never total. It did not need to be. It was sufficient. For centuries, ships left Cretan shores and returned again, weaving an invisible web across the Mediterranean. That web carried goods, ideas, and influence far beyond what the island's size would suggest. This was an empire without provinces, a power without borders, a dominance measured not in land taken, but in roots maintained. The sea was their empire because it could not be owned, only understood, and in understanding it better than anyone else of their time, the Minoans shaped a world that moved to their rhythm, even if it never bore their name. Gods, goddesses, and sacred ritual. Long before gods were given fixed names, long before myths were written down and arranged into orderly genealogies, belief on Crete lived close to the ground, the sky, and the sea. It was not confined to temples or guarded by walls. It moved through daily life quietly, woven into farming seasons, journeys by boat, the birth of children, and the slow passing of years. Religion on Crete did not begin as a system. It began as attention to the land that fed but could also withhold, attention to the sea that connected but could also take lives without warning, attention to the mountains that loomed silently above every settlement, unchanged by generations of human effort. To live on Crete was to live surrounded by forces that could not be controlled. Belief arose not as an attempt to dominate these forces, but to recognize them, acknowledge them, and exist alongside them. The earliest sacred places were not built, they were found, caves opened into the earth like mouths, cool and dark even in summer, echoing with dripping water and the sound of footsteps. Peaks rose above the island, visible from miles away, catching storms and sunlight alike. Springs emerged from rock without warning, offering life where none should exist. These places did not need explanation. They felt different. People returned to them again and again, leaving small offerings, pottery fragments, figurines, tools, food, objects drawn from daily life rather than made solely for ritual. The boundary between sacred and ordinary was thin. Over time, patterns formed. Mountain peaks became gathering places for communal ritual. From these heights, the island unfolded in every direction: fields, villages, coastline, and distant sea. Standing there, one could see the world as a whole, not fragmented into valleys and paths. These peak sanctuaries were not enclosed temples. They were open spaces exposed to wind, sun, and cloud. Rituals performed here were public and collective, visible to the sky itself. The gods, whatever they were not imagined as distant beings hidden away. They were present in the elements. Caves offered a different intimacy. Entering them meant leaving light behind, moving inward and downward. Here, offerings accumulated slowly, layer upon layer, across centuries. These were not places for spectacle. They were places for quiet exchange. The earth received what people brought. Water held special significance. Springs and wells were treated with care. They were lifelines in a land where dryness could last months. To protect water was to protect life itself. It is no coincidence that symbols associated with renewal, fertility, and continuity appear repeatedly in Minoan art. Among these symbols, certain forms recur with striking consistency. The double axe, the labries, appears carved into stone, painted on walls, and shaped into votive objects. Its meaning is still debated, but its presence suggests power connected not to warfare, but to ritual, perhaps linked to sacrifice, authority, or divine presence. Animals carried meaning as well. Bulls appear frequently, not as enemies to be slain, but as potent forces, strong, dangerous, vital. Ritual interaction with animals, especially bulls, seems to have held deep symbolic weight, tied to vitality, fertility, and the unpredictable energy of life itself. Snakes, often associated with renewal due to their shedding skin, appear coiled around figurines or held calmly in human hands. These images do not suggest fear, They suggest familiarity. The gods of Crete were not distant tyrants. They were forces embedded in nature, approached through participation rather than obedience. This worldview shaped the structure of religious authority. There is little evidence for a centralized priesthood issuing doctrine or enforcing belief. Instead, ritual leadership appears distributed. Certain individuals, likely women and men recognized for knowledge, experience, or lineage, guided ceremonies, preserved traditions, and mediated between community and sacred space. Religion was enacted rather than proclaimed. Palaces later became important ritual centers, but they did not replace older sacred sites. Instead, they incorporated them. Courtyards hosted processions, storerooms supplied offerings. Frescoes depicted ritual scenes alongside everyday activities, blurring the distinction between sacred and secular life. The palace did not monopolize belief, it organized it. This integration strengthened legitimacy. By aligning administrative authority with ritual continuity, the palace embedded itself within a worldview already respected. Giving to the palace was not just economic, it was devotional. Festivals punctuated the year. These were moments when communities gathered, reaffirmed bonds, and synchronized their lives with seasonal rhythms. Music, dance, movement. These were not decorations added to ritual. They were ritual. Minoan art captures this vividly. Figures leap, turn, reach, and flow. Bodies are not rigid or hieratic. They are alive. This suggests a belief system centered on vitality rather than transcendence. Even the gods, when represented, are rarely shown as towering, remote figures. They appear embedded within scenes, participating rather than overseeing. Gender roles within Minoan religion appear unusually balanced, perhaps even female-centered. Figurines and frescoes suggest prominent female figures engaged in ritual leadership. Whether this reflects goddess worship, priestess authority, or symbolic representation is debated, but the emphasis is clear. Power in Minoan belief was not exclusively masculine or militarized, it was generative. This orientation aligns with the island's broader political culture. Society that avoided overt kingship also avoided divine kingship. No ruler claimed to be a god on earth. No deity was used to justify absolute control. Instead, belief reinforced cooperation and continuity. Death, too, was approached with restraint. Burial practices varied, but they rarely emphasized monumental display. The dead were remembered, not elevated above the living. Ancestors remained part of community memory rather than distant heroes. The afterlife, if imagined, does not appear to have dominated Minoan thought. Attention remained focused on sustaining life here and now. This does not mean fear was absent. Earthquakes shook the island repeatedly. Storms destroyed crops and ships. Volcanic events darkened skies and altered coastlines. Such forces demanded explanation and appeasement. Ritual responded not with terror, but with repetition. The same offerings, the same gestures, the same movements enacted again and again. Stability through practice. Over centuries, belief systems adapted without breaking. New symbols appeared. Old ones persisted. External influences arrived through trade and contact, but they were filtered and reinterpreted. Crete did not adopt foreign gods. Wholesale, it reshaped them. This adaptability made Minoan religion resilient. When disasters struck, belief did not collapse. It absorbed shock and continued. The absence of sacred texts may have contributed to this flexibility. Without fixed scripture, belief could evolve quietly. Tradition lived in action rather than word. Ritual knowledge was embodied, learned by doing, by watching, by participating from childhood onward. This embodiment explains the power of movement in Minoan ritual imagery. To move correctly was to believe correctly. At its core, Minoan religion was relational. It defined relationships between people and land, people and sea, people and each other. It did not demand conquest of nature, it demanded attentiveness. In this way, belief mirrored the island itself, complex, layered, resistant to simplification. Later cultures would try to explain Crete through myth, labyrinths, monsters, heroic kings, but beneath those stories lies a quieter reality, the sacred. The world of the Minoans was not built to impress outsiders. It was built to sustain insiders. It gave meaning to uncertainty, rhythm to time, and coherence to a society that valued balance over domination. It allowed power to exist without crowns, authority without fear, and continuity without stagnation. The gods of Crete did not rule from the heavens. They lived in mountains, caves, animals, water, and movement, and for centuries that was enough. Art, frescoes, and the Minoan view of life. To understand how the Minoans saw themselves, one must look not at their weapons, their rulers, or their laws, but at their walls. Long before their civilization was given a name, before later Greeks tried to explain it through myths of kings and monsters, the people of Crete covered their buildings with images that spoke quietly but persistently about what they valued. These images did not tell stories of conquest. They did not glorify death or dominance. Instead, they moved. Movement is the first thing that strikes the eye. Figures bend, leap, twist, and reach. Animals surge forward mid-stride. Plants curl and unfold as if stirred by wind. Nothing stands stiff or eternal. Everything appears caught in a moment of becoming. This is not accidental. It is worldview made visible. Minoan art does not present life as something to be ordered and fixed. It presents life as something to be entered, navigated, and experienced. The world, as the Minoans painted it, was not static. It flowed. Nowhere is this clearer than in the frescoes that once covered palace walls. These were not small decorative panels. They filled corridors, stairwells, courtyards, and upper stories. They accompanied daily movement, wrapping inhabitants in colour and form as they went about their lives. Art was not set apart. It was lived with. The subjects chosen reveal priorities. Nature dominates. Birds, dolphins, lilies, reeds, rocks, and waves appear again and again. Humans are present but rarely alone. They exist within landscapes rather than above them. Even ritual scenes emphasize participation rather than control. The sea, so central to Minoan life, appears not as a boundary or threat but as a familiar presence. Dolphins arc playfully across walls, their bodies curved in rhythmic repetition. Fish glide effortlessly. Water is rendered not as chaos, but as motion understood. These images do not depict fear of the sea. They depict intimacy with it. Human figures are shown with similar fluency. Bodies are elongated, flexible, poised between action and rest. Limbs curve, spines bend. Faces are stylized but expressive. The emphasis is not on individual portraiture, but on vitality. This aesthetic choice reflects something profound. Minoan identity was not rooted in rigid hierarchy or immutable roles. It was rooted in participation, being part of a larger rhythm. Even when figures are distinguished by clothing or posture or scale, the differences feel contextual rather than absolute. There is little sense of domination. No one towers permanently over others. Authority, when implied, is situational. The famous bull-leaping scenes capture this ethos vividly. Humans engage directly with powerful animals, not to kill them, but to move with them. The bull is not an enemy. It is a force, dangerous, alive, worthy of respect. The act depicted is not conquest, it is coordination. This tells us something essential about how the Minoans understood strength. Strength was not measured by the ability to destroy, but by the ability to engage without being overwhelmed. Nature is not something to be subdued in Minoan art. It is something to be met. Colour reinforces this worldview. Minoan artists used vivid pigments, reds, blues, whites, blacks, applied boldly and confidently. Backgrounds are often light, creating a sense of openness rather than enclosure. Scenes breathe. These colours were not chosen for realism alone. They conveyed energy. They heightened contrast. They made movement legible from a distance. Walls became living surfaces. The technique itself mattered. Frescoes were painted onto wet plaster, requiring speed, planning, and confidence. Mistakes could not easily be corrected. Each brushstroke committed the artist to a decision. This urgency mirrors the subject matter. Art was not endlessly revised. It was enacted. The artists were not anonymous decorators. They were skilled participants in a cultural language understood across the island. Styles spread between palaces and settlements, suggesting shared training and shared values. This shared aesthetic created cohesion without uniformity. Pottery echoes the same sensibilities. Early geometric designs give way to flowing, organic forms. Marine-style pottery fills surfaces with octopus tentacles, seaweed, shells, forms that wrap around vessels without clear beginning or end. These objects were handled daily. They brought this worldview into ordinary moments, eating, storing, pouring. Art was not reserved for elites, it circulated. Clothing depicted in frescoes is equally revealing. Garments emphasize movement rather than restriction. Figures appear dressed for flexibility, not armour. Jewellery and adornment suggest appreciation for beauty without excess. Attention to appearance was not about hierarchy, it was about expression. Gender representation in Minoan art is particularly striking. Women appear frequently, often in prominent roles, participating in ritual, observing events, moving confidently through spaces. They are not confined to the margins. Men and women are shown differently, but neither is consistently dominant. Both are active. This visual balance suggests a society that did not define identity solely through rigid gender hierarchy. Roles existed, but they did not erase presence. Children appear rarely, but when they do, they are not idealized symbols. They are small participants in a larger flow of life. Age, like gender, is part of the whole rather than a marker of exclusion. Even architecture reinforces these themes. Minoan spaces are complex but not oppressive. Rooms open into courtyards. Light enters from multiple angles. Staircases encourage movement upward and downward, not confinement. The built environment mirrors the art that covers it. There is a notable absence in all of this: violence. Scenes of warfare, executions, or humiliation are virtually non-existent. This does not mean the Minoans lived without conflict, but it does mean they chose not to define themselves through it visually. What a society chooses to depict reveals what it chooses to remember. By remembering movement, nature, ritual, and beauty, the Minoans constructed an identity centered on life rather than death. This choice also had political implications. A culture that values flow over rigidity is less likely to produce rigid authority. A culture that sees itself as embedded in nature is less likely to justify absolute domination. Art here is not decoration, it is philosophy. Over time, these visual languages shaped memory. Even after the Minoans faded as a distinct political force, their imagery endured. Later, Greeks encountered ruins filled with colour and movement unlike anything they knew. They struggled to interpret it. Thus arose myths, labyrinths, monsters, lost kings, attempts to impose familiar narratives on something fundamentally different. But the walls themselves tell a quieter, Truth. The Minoan view of life was not tragic. It was not heroic in the later sense. It was experiential. It embraced uncertainty, motion, and participation. Identity was not forged through conquest. It was sustained through rhythm. To walk through a Minoan palace was to be surrounded by reminders of this rhythm. Waves curling endlessly, bodies in motion, animals alive with power, plants reaching and bending. Art taught people how to be in the world. It taught them that balance was not stillness, that strength did not require domination, that beauty was not separate from function. In this way, Minoan art was not a reflection of life. It was a guide to living, and long after the pigments faded and the walls fell silent, that vision remains one of the clearest windows we have into our civilization once chose to see itself, not as rulers of the world, but as participants within it. Life inside the palaces. Farmers, artisans and scribes. Life inside the palaces of Crete did not unfold like life inside a royal court elsewhere in the Bronze Age world. There were no silent corridors reserved only for kings, no sharply defined line between those who ruled and those who served. Instead, the palaces were busy places, alive with sound, movement, work, and routine. They were not isolated seats of power, they were engines. Every day began not with ceremony, but with labour. Before the sun climbed high, people were already moving through palace spaces. Courtyards filled gradually, not with crowds gathered for spectacle, but with workers arriving to perform tasks that sustained the wider system. Some came from nearby settlements, others lived close to the palace itself. They carried tools, baskets, raw materials, and finished goods. The palace absorbed them all. Farmers were the foundation of everything, even though they rarely remained inside palace walls for long. Their lives were anchored in the countryside, fields, terraces, orchards and pastures shaped by generations of careful use. But their labour flowed into the palace through grain, oil, wine, wool and livestock products delivered season by season. This was not tribute in the sense of forced extraction. It was participation in a shared system. Farmers knew where their produce went. They saw it stored, redistributed, prepared for trade, or used to support communal projects. In return, they gained security. In years of poor harvest, the palace mattered most. Inside storerooms, massive clay jars stood in ordered rows, some taller than a person. These vessels were not symbolic. They were practical measures of stability. Grain could be stored against hunger. Oil could be rationed carefully. Wine could be preserved and shared. Someone had to manage this abundance. Scribes moved quietly through these spaces, carrying clay tablets still soft enough to receive impressions. Using the script we now call linear A, they recorded quantities, movements, and allocations. Their work was not dramatic, it was precise. A mistake could mean shortage later. Writing here was not a marker of elite culture, it was a tool of survival. Scribes occupied an unusual position in palace society. They were not rulers, but they were indispensable. They knew what was stored, what was owed, what was planned. Their authority came from accuracy rather than command. In a world built on redistribution, memory mattered. Nearby, artisans worked in workshops integrated directly into palace complexes. Potters shaped vessels not only for daily use, but for storage, ritual, and export. Their hands moved with confidence born of repetition. Styles were recognizable, standardized enough to signal origin, yet flexible enough to allow expression. Weavers worked with wool and flax, turning raw fibres into textiles that were both functional and valuable. Cloth was wealth in a world without coinage. It clothed. People marked status, served as trade goods, and played a role in ritual. Metalworkers handled materials that arrived from far beyond Crete. Copper, tin, and other metals passed through palace-controlled channels, ensuring access remained coordinated. Tools, weapons, and ornaments emerged from these workshops, shaped with care rather than mass production. Artisans were specialists, but they were not isolated elites. Their work tied them closely to the palace, yet their identities remained grounded in skill rather than rank. What mattered was what you could do, not whom you descended from. Movement through the palace reflected this fluid hierarchy. Corridors funneled people efficiently between workspaces, storerooms, and courtyards. Staircases linked levels without grand separation. Light entered from above and from open spaces, reducing the sense of enclosure. The architecture encouraged circulation rather than isolation. Meals were taken as part of work rhythms, food distributed from palace stores fed those labouring within its walls. Workers, scribes, artisans, ritual participants. Eating reinforced belonging. To eat from palace stores was to be part of the system. Hierarchy existed, but it was subtle. Those closest to administration, senior scribes, coordinators of labour, ritual leaders, held influence. They had better access to resources, information and decision-making, but their authority depended on competence. Failure could not be hidden easily in such an interconnected environment. There is little evidence that palace life was defined by rigid social classes locked into place by birth. Status could shift through skill, experience, and trust. This does not mean society was equal, but it does mean mobility existed. Women appear prominently in palace contexts. They are shown in art, participating in ritual, overseeing activities, and moving confidently through spaces. In daily life, they likely manage textile production, food processing, and aspects of ritual organisation. Their presence was structural, not decorative. Children grew up observing this world. They learned by watching how grain was measured, how tools were used, how offerings were prepared, how writing marks translated into action. Education was practical and embodied. The palace taught through example. Time inside the palace moved differently than time in the fields. It was less tied to seasons and more to schedules, deliveries, inventories, rituals, departures of ships. This required coordination across many roles, and yet the palace never fully separated itself from the countryside. It depended on it too deeply. At moments of ritual, daily life and belief intersected openly. Processions moved through courtyards. Offerings were prepared from stored goods. Music, movement, and shared presence reaffirmed the meaning of work. Labour was not just economic, it was moral. The palace reinforced this by making work visible. Tasks were performed in shared spaces. Results were seen and used. There was little room for abstraction. This visibility fostered trust. Even the absence of monumental thrones or private royal quarters speaks volumes. No individual dominated palace space. Authority was embedded in process rather than person. Palace life could be demanding. It required consistency, attention, and cooperation, but it also offered security, connection, and purpose. People knew how their effort fit into something larger. This may explain the longevity of the system. It did not rely on fear, it relied on participation. When disasters struck, earthquakes, fires, shortages, the palace did not collapse inward as a court might. It reorganised, labour shifted, priorities changed. The same people who worked within it rebuilt it. They did so because the palace was not an alien imposition. It was an extension of their lives. In later times, outsiders would look at these ruins and imagine kings, courts, and commands issuing from hidden chambers. But the reality was quieter and more complex. The palace was not where life was displayed. It was where life was managed. Farmers, artisans, and scribes were not supporting a distant elite. They were sustaining a system that in turn sustained them. Hierarchy existed, but it was functional rather than theatrical. Authority was earned through competence, reinforced through ritual, and maintained through redistribution. Inside the palaces, daily life unfolded not as obedience to power, but as collaboration with it, and for centuries that collaboration held the Minoan world together. Writing without words, Linear A, and the lost language. There are voices everywhere in the ruins of Crete, voices pressed into clay, scratched lightly into stone, sealed beneath collapsed walls and layers of ash. They are voices that once spoke of grain and oil, of labour owed and labour given, of movement, storage and planning. They spoke clearly to those who made them. They were never meant to be heard by us. Today, they are silent. This silence has a name, Linear A. It is one of the most haunting remnants of the Minoan world, not because it is decorative or mysterious by intention, but because it worked perfectly and then vanished, leaving behind meaning without sound. Linear A was not a literary script. It was not designed to preserve myths, prayers, or heroic memory. It did not record poetry or history. It existed for one purpose, administration, and because of that it tells us almost everything about how the Minoan world functioned, except the words themselves. The earliest marks appear quietly, emerging as the palaces expanded and systems of redistribution grew more complex. Before writing, memory had been human, stored in people who knew what had been delivered, what was owed, what was promised. But as scale increased, memory needed help. Clay provided that help. Small tablets were formed quickly, soft enough to receive impressions, hard enough to survive handling. Scribes pressed signs into them while the clay was wet, recording quantities and categories rather than stories. Once dried, the tablet became a frozen moment, an agreement made tangible. These tablets were not meant to last forever. Many were likely recycled, erased or discarded after their information was no longer needed. Their survival is accidental, preserved only because fires hardened them permanently during destruction events. What we have then are not archives meant for posterity. They are administrative leftovers, saved by disaster, and yet they are remarkably consistent. Linear A signs repeat across the island. The same symbols appear at multiple palatial centres, written in similar hands, arranged in familiar patterns. This was not experimentation, it was standardisation. The script worked because everyone who needed it understood it. It recorded commodities, grain, oil, wine, livestock, textiles, using ideograms and numerical signs. It tracked movement rather than emotion. A tablet might represent deliveries from a village, allocations to a workshop, or reserves set aside for ritual or trade. Each mark carried obligation. Writing in this context did not elevate the scribe above society. It bound the scribe into it. Accuracy mattered because lives depended on it. A miscount could mean hunger months later. A missed entry could disrupt redistribution. This gave writing moral weight. The scribes themselves occupied a unique position. They were trained specialists, but not a separate caste. Their authority came from precision, not secrecy. They worked in visible spaces, storerooms, administrative rooms, workshops, where their records could be checked against physical reality. Writing did not replace trust, it supported it. Linear A was often accompanied by seal impressions. Individuals carried seals carved with distinctive designs, animals, geometric patterns, abstract forms. Pressed into clay, these seals marked responsibility. They said, in effect, "This count was made by me." Identity here was functional, not narrative. What makes Linear A so compelling today is not just that it is undeciphered, but that it refuses to perform for us. We cannot coax myths from it. We cannot reconstruct prayers or personal names with confidence. It denies us drama. Instead, It confronts us with a civilization that wrote without trying to be remembered. This was a profound choice. Many ancient cultures used writing to project power across time, to announce kings, victories, divine favour. The Minoans used it to manage systems in the present. Their writing faced inward, not outward. Because of this, Linear A vanished almost without trace once the systems that required it collapsed or transformed. When new powers arrived and new languages took hold, the script was no longer useful. It was not sacred. It did not need to be preserved. Silence followed. For modern scholars, this silence is frustrating. We can count signs, compare patterns, identify repeated structures. We know what Linear A did, but not what it said. We see the scaffolding of meaning without the words themselves. And yet, this absence tells its own story. It suggests that the Minoans did not define themselves through written narrative. Their identity lived elsewhere, in architecture, ritual, art, movement, and practice. Writing was a tool, not a mirror. This aligns with everything else we see. A society without monumental kingship, without heroic epics carved into stone, without walls proclaiming dominance. A society that valued flow over fixation. Linear A fits perfectly into that world. Even its visual character reflects this. The signs are compact, efficient, repeated with minor variation. They do not strive for beauty. They strive for clarity. They were meant to disappear after use. That they did not, at least not entirely, is an accident of fire and collapse. The tablets we hold today are echoes, hardened moments never meant to outlast their context. There is something fitting about this. A civilization so attuned to movement, to impermanence, to cycles, left behind a writing system that refuses to speak once its moment passed. Later cultures would overwrite it. New scripts would appear, using some of the same signs, but mapping them onto different sounds and languages. Linear B would come, speaking Greek, recording kings and palaces of a very different kind. Linear A would remain beneath it, unreadable, like a language spoken once and then absorbed back into silence. This silence has invited speculation, lost names, forgotten gods, secret histories. But perhaps the greatest mistake is to assume that what we cannot read must have contained what we expect. Linear A does not hide epics. It hides logistics. It hides the daily decisions that kept an island alive. It hides the quiet coordination of labour and land. It hides a world view that did not feel the need to explain itself to the future. In this way, Linear A is not a failure of communication. It is a boundary. It reminds us that not every civilization wanted to be remembered in words. Some were content to be lived, and so the tablets remain, rows of signs pressed by hands long gone, speaking fluently to a world that no longer exists, and saying nothing at all to us except this. That meaning does not always survive translation, and that silence too is a legacy. Earthquake, fire, and ash. Disaster in the Aegean. For centuries, life on Crete had been shaped by forces that moved slowly. Seasons, trade winds, generational change, the patient growth of systems and habits. The Minoan world was built to adapt, to bend, to absorb shock. But not all forces arrive gradually. Some come without warning, tearing through the fabric of daily life faster than memory can respond. The island sat on a fault line, though its people had no name for such things. They only knew the feeling, the sudden shudder beneath the feet, the walls that groaned and split, the ground that rolled like water for a breathless moment. Earthquakes were not rare. They were part of existence. Crete learned early that the earth itself could not be trusted to remain still. At first, these tremors were manageable. Buildings cracked and were repaired, walls leaned and were straightened, floors sank and were raised again. The palaces themselves bear witness to this long familiarity. With destruction, foundations rebuilt, corridors shifted, rooms reinforced, layer upon layer. Earthquakes did not end the Minoan world, they shaped it. Architecture adapted, walls thickened, columns tapered downward, wider at the top than the base, allowing them to flex rather than snap. Multiple stories were supported by careful distribution of weight. Open courtyards reduced structural stress. Nothing was built with the assumption of permanence. Destruction became part of the building cycle, but adaptation has limits, and the Aegean was not finished testing them. Fire followed earth. In dense palace complexes filled with wooden beams, stored oils, textiles, and workshops, a single collapse could ignite chains of destruction. Lamps overturned, hearths spilled embers, storerooms burned fiercely once ignited. Fire hardened clay tablets preserving them for us, but it also erased lives, tools, and memory in an instant. After each fire, people returned. They cleared debris, they rebuilt, they re-established routines. The palaces rose again, altered but recognisable. This resilience is striking. It speaks of confidence, not blind optimism, but a belief that systems could be restored. Yet each rebuilding drew on reserves, labour, materials, trust. Stress accumulated quietly. Fields still had to be planted. Ships still had to sail. Storerooms still had to be filled. Every disaster diverted energy away from growth and toward recovery. Over time, this changed the balance. And then came ash. Far to the north of Crete, beyond the horizon, an island began to tear itself apart. What we now call the Thera eruption was not a single explosion, but a sequence of escalating catastrophes. Earthquakes shook the region first, unsettling coastlines and damaging settlements. Then the volcano itself erupted with a violence almost unimaginable. Ash rose into the sky in towering columns. The sea boiled. The island collapsed inward. Waves radiated outward across the Aegean. When the ash finally began to fall, it did not respect borders. Crete lay downwind. Fine volcanic particles drifted across the island, settling on fields, clogging water sources, dimming sunlight. Crops failed. Pastures suffered. The disruption may not have been immediately lethal, but it was destabilizing. An agricultural system finely tuned to balance could not easily absorb sudden climatic shock. Along the coasts, the sea itself turned hostile. Tsunami waves, generated by volcanic collapse and seismic disturbance, struck low-lying harbours and settlements. Boats were smashed, shore installations were destroyed, salt water flooded fields near the coast, poisoning soil for years. Maritime networks faltered. This mattered more than it might seem. The Minoan world depended on movement. When ships could not sail reliably, when harbours were damaged or silted, when trade routes became unpredictable, the connective tissue of the system weakened. Isolation crept back in. The palaces, already strained by repeated rebuilding, now faced shortages. Redistribution systems depended on surplus. Surplus depended on stability. Stability was gone. This did not cause immediate collapse. Nothing in the Minoan world failed all at once. Instead, stress fractures appeared. Some regions recovered better than others. Some palaces were rebuilt again, others were not. Authority began to fragment. Local centres gained importance as central coordination struggled. The balance between cooperation and control shifted. People adapted as best they could. They always had. But adaptation requires time, and time was no longer generous. The psychological toll should not be underestimated. A society accustomed to renewal through repetition now faced disruption without clear resolution. Rituals continued, but their reassurance may have weakened. Offerings could not restore lost ships or poisoned fields. Belief systems built around balance were tested by excess. The earth was no longer merely unpredictable. It was overwhelming. Into this instability came new pressures. Mainland powers less affected or differently affected by the same events began to exert greater influence. Systems that had once been equal exchanges became imbalanced. Dependence replaced reciprocity. The Minoan world did not collapse because it was fragile. It collapsed because it was finely tuned. Its strengths, connectivity, openness, lack of militarization became vulnerabilities in a world suddenly harsher and more competitive. When networks fail, those who rely on them most suffer first. Palaces fell silent not because people vanished overnight, but because the systems that gave those spaces meaning no longer functioned. Storerooms emptied. Administrative routines ceased. Writing stopped. Art faded. Life continued, but it was no longer the same life. Earthquakes continued to shake Crete. Fires continued to burn. Ash continued to mark layers of soil and memory. Each event alone was survivable. Together, across generations, they reshaped the island. The collapse of the Minoan system was not a dramatic end. It was an unravelling. Later cultures would remember fragments, stories of labyrinths, monsters, lost kings. These myths tried to make sense of ruins whose causes were too complex, too impersonal, too geological to fit heroic narratives. But the truth is quieter and more unsettling. The Minoans did not fall because they failed. They fell because the world they had mastered changed faster than their systems could follow. Earthquake, fire, and ash did not destroy a civilization in a single moment. They applied pressure again and again, until balance, so carefully maintained, could no longer be restored. What remains today are stones shifted out of alignment, walls darkened by fire, streets buried beneath ash, and beneath them the memory of a society that understood movement, adaptation, and resilience, until the ground itself demanded more than even it could give. In the end, the disaster was not just natural, it was systemic, and that is why its echoes still linger across the Aegean long after the earth grew quiet again. The coming of the Mycenaeans. Conquest or absorption? The change did not arrive like a storm breaking on the shore. There were no burning fleets appearing suddenly on the horizon, no final battle etched into memory, no single year that could be pointed to and named as the end. Instead, it arrived the way tides do, quietly, persistently, altering the shoreline a little more each season until the land itself felt unfamiliar. This was the coming of the Mycenaeans. For centuries, the people of Crete had shaped the Aegean through movement, trade, ritual, and administration. Their power had never rested on armies or fortifications. It rested on systems, networks of exchange, trust, and coordination that stretched across the sea. But systems are vulnerable to disruption, and by the late Bronze Age, the Minoan world was under strain. Earthquakes had shaken palaces repeatedly. Fire had erased entire administrative cycles. Ash had dimmed fields and harbours. Trade routes had faltered. Authority had fragmented. It was into this altered landscape that mainland influence began to deepen. The Mycenaean world was different in temperament and structure, centred on fortified citadels like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos. Mainland society emphasised hierarchy, warrior elites, and visible power. Kings ruled from elevated strongholds. Status was reinforced through burial, weaponry, and lineage. Authority was proclaimed. Where the Minoan world flowed, the Mycenaean world anchored. Contact between these two worlds was not new. For generations, Minoan ships had visited mainland ports. Minoan goods circulated widely. Mainland elites admired Cretan craftsmanship and ritual sophistication. Influence initially flowed from south to north, but influence does not move in only one direction forever. As Manos and systems weakened, Mycenaean participation increased. Mainland traders, administrators, and possibly military groups began to appear more frequently on Crete. They did not arrive as outsiders. They arrived as partners, specialists, and intermediaries. At first, the change was subtle. Minoan palaces continued to function, though some were abandoned while others persisted. Knossos, in particular, remained active even as other centres fell silent. But the nature of activity within its walls began to shift. Writing changed. Where Linear A had once recorded the quiet movement of goods, a new script appeared, Linear B. Though visually related, it represented a different language, an early form of Greek. The same clay tablets now spoke with a different voice. This is one of the clearest signs of transition. Linear B did not simply replace Linear A overnight. It emerged within existing administrative spaces, using familiar systems for unfamiliar purposes. Storerooms were still counted. Goods were still tracked. But the language of power had changed. This suggests not a sudden conquest, but a takeover of systems. Those who controlled administration controlled society. Mycenaean elites seem to have understood this well. Rather than dismantling the palatial infrastructure of Crete, they occupied it. They repurposed it. They spoke through it. Knossos did not burn and vanish at the moment of Mycenaean arrival. It continued. Altered, adapted, increasingly aligned with mainland practices. Architecture reflects this shift. Defensive features appear more prominently. Storage patterns change. Administrative priorities become more centralized and more rigid. The palace begins to resemble a mainland centre more than a purely Minoan one. Art changes as well. The fluid movement of earlier frescoes gives way to more static, formal imagery. Symbols associated with power become sharper, more martial. The aesthetic of flow begins to stiffen. This does not mean Minoan culture disappeared. Far from it. Much of what the Mycenaeans adopted from Crete endured. Religious practices persisted. Artistic motifs survived. Maritime knowledge remained essential. Even the palace system itself, so alien to early mainland traditions, was inherited rather than destroyed. This is why the question remains unresolved: conquest or absorption? The archaeological record suggests elements of both. There is evidence of violence in some places, destruction layers, abrupt abandonment, changes in burial practices. But there is also continuity. Families remaining in place, crafts continuing, religious sites still used. What seems most likely is not a single event, but a process. As Minoan authority weakened, Mycenaean influence filled the gaps. Some regions resisted, others adapted, elites intermarried, administrators learned new languages, rituals were reinterpreted, power shifted without always changing hands violently. For ordinary people, daily life may not have felt dramatically different at first. Fields were still planted, ships still sailed, work still needed to be done. But over time, the tone changed. Authority became more visible, more hierarchical. Decisions flowed downward rather than outward. Redistribution served elite priorities more directly. The palace was no longer primarily a coordinator. It was a command centre. This marked a fundamental transformation. The Minoan world had been built on soft power, connection, reputation, mutual benefit. The Mycenaean world emphasised hard power, control, defence, and assertion. When stress intensified across the Aegean, the latter proved more adaptable to conflict. The sea itself changed meaning. Where it had once been a shared space of exchange, it became contested. Ships carried not just goods, but warriors. Routes were no longer guaranteed safe by familiarity alone. Crete adjusted, but at a cost. Minoan identity slowly dissolved into something new. Not erased, but subsumed. Its innovations lived on, sometimes in altered form, within Mycenaean civilization. The mainland Greeks inherited Cretan administration, art, religion, and maritime skill, but they used them differently. By the time Mycenaean power fully dominated Crete, the island was no longer setting the rhythm of the Aegean. It was following one. Its palaces spoke Greek. Its authority answered to mainland interests. Its role shifted from centre to province. And yet, the legacy endured. Later Greek myths remembered Crete as ancient, powerful, mysterious. They remembered Minos as a king of terrifying authority, ruling the sea itself. These stories were distortions, but meaningful ones. They reflected a memory of real influence transformed by later values. The labyrinth, the monster, the tribute, all are echoes of a society that once organised life through systems too complex to explain simply. In the end, the Mycenaeans did not extinguish the Minoans. They absorbed them. The Minoan world ended not with annihilation, but with translation. Its language replaced, its power restructured, its identity folded into something larger and more warlike. Crete remained inhabited. Life continued. But the island, between worlds, no longer stood apart in the same way. Its quiet empire of sea and systems had given way to a louder age, one that would eventually collapse as well. And beneath that collapse, buried deeper still, lay the memory of a civilization that had once ruled without walls, without kings, and without needing to say so. The civilization that vanished, Minoan legacy and myth. Civilizations do not always end with silence. Sometimes they end with stories. Long after the palaces of Crete emptied, long after corridors filled with dust and light no longer fell on painted walls, the Minoans continued to exist, not as a people, but as an idea, an echo, a question that refused to settle. They vanished without leaving behind a voice that could explain them. No epic poem, no royal inscriptions, no written memory of who they believed themselves to be when the world they knew began to slip away. What remained were ruins and impressions. To later generations, these remains felt unsettling. The stones were too complex, the spaces too intricate, the art too alive. This was not the work of a primitive past struggling towards civilization. This was something fully formed, refined, confident, and strangely unfamiliar. The Greeks who inherited the Aegean landscape walked among these remnants with a sense of unease. They knew greatness when they saw it, but this greatness did not resemble their own, and so they remembered it as myth. In Greek memory, Crete became a place of paradox. It was ancient even to the ancients, powerful but strange, civilized yet dangerous. At the centre of these stories stood figures like Minos, not a bureaucrat, not an administrator, but a king of terrible authority, a lawgiver, a judge of the dead. The palace became a labyrinth. The complexity of architecture became confusion. The absence of visible kings became tyranny reimagined. Where the Minoans had ruled through systems, the Greeks understood rule through figures. Where the Minoans had embraced flow, the Greeks sought narrative. Thus emerged the Minotaur, a monster trapped at the heart of the palace, a creature that demanded tribute, a symbol, perhaps, of a system too vast, too impersonal, too incomprehensible to later eyes. Myth did not lie deliberately, it translated. The most famous of these translations is Atlantis, when Plato wrote of a powerful island civilization that ruled the sea, rich, advanced, and ultimately destroyed by catastrophe. He framed it as allegory, a moral lesson about hubris and decline. But his audience did not invent Atlantis out of nothing. The memory of a sea-dominating culture already existed. Plato's Atlantis was not Crete, but Crete made Atlantis imaginable. An island, a thalassocracy, advanced beyond its neighbours, struck down by earthquakes in the sea. The parallels were too close to ignore. Over time, Atlantis became a vessel into which people poured longing and warning, a lost golden age, a civilization punished for its success, a reminder that greatness could vanish overnight. In this way, the Minoans lived on, not as themselves, but as cautionary shadow. Yet myth alone cannot sustain memory forever. For centuries, Crete's ruins lay half-buried, scavenged for stone, reshaped by later inhabitants who reused walls without knowing their origins. The vibrant colours faded, the names were forgotten. Then archaeology arrived, and in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, excavations began to peel back the layers. What emerged was not the brutal, tyrannical world of myth, but something quieter, more unsettling in its difference. Palaces without fortifications, art without violence, power without kings. The archaeologists expected temples and thrones. They found storerooms and staircases. They expected monuments to rulers. They found systems. Even now, this discovery remains difficult to absorb. We are accustomed to civilizations announcing themselves loudly through conquest, monuments, and written self-justification. The Minoans did none of this. Their legacy had to be reconstructed from absence as much as presence. And yet, their influence is undeniable. They shaped the Aegean world that followed. The Mycenaeans inherited their administrative models, their maritime expertise, their religious frameworks. Greek myth absorbed their symbols, bulls, labyrinths, sacred mountains. Greek art learned from their sense of movement and life. Even Greek ideas of law and order may echo faintly from Crete's earlier systems. Redistribution, balance, collective obligation. The Minoans did not found Greece, but Greece did not emerge without them. This makes their disappearance all the more haunting. They did not fall to a single enemy. They were not wiped away by conquest alone. They were not erased by collapse overnight. They dissolved. Their systems were absorbed. Their language was replaced. Their identity blurred until it could no longer be distinguished from what came after. Crete remained inhabited, but the Minoan way of being faded quietly into the background. This kind of ending resists drama. It offers no clear villain, no heroic last stand, but it offers something more honest. Civilizations do not always die because they fail. Sometimes they die because the world they were built for no longer exists. The Minoans mastered a particular balance between land and sea, hierarchy and cooperation, ritual and labour, movement and stability. When that balance was disrupted too many times, when the Aegean became harsher, more militarised, more competitive, their model no longer fit, and so it gave way. What remains today is influence without identity, presence without voice, a civilization that shaped the world but refused to explain itself to the future. This refusal may be the most radical legacy of all. The Minoans remind us that power does not always seek permanence, that culture does not always aim to be remembered, that some societies invest fully in the present rather than in monuments to eternity. They trusted systems more than stories, practice more than proclamation, life more than legacy. And yet, despite that, they are remembered. Not clearly, not accurately, but persistently. In ruins walked by tourists, in myths retold endlessly, in the unanswered silence of Linear A, in the idea that a civilization once ruled the sea without ruling through fear. The Minoans vanished, but they did not disappear. They linger, in questions rather than answers, in movement rather than stone, in the unsettling realization that one of the most sophisticated cultures of the ancient world chose not to speak loudly to the future. And perhaps that is why, thousands of years later, we are still listening. The Minoans did not disappear the way empires usually do. There was no final proclamation, no last stand remembered in song, no single moment when the world stopped and said, "This is the end." Instead, their civilization thinned, softened, and slowly blended into what came next. Their palaces emptied, not all at once, but room by room. Corridors that once echoed with footsteps grew quiet. Storerooms that once measured abundance fell into disuse. Writing ceased, not because it failed, but because the system it served no longer existed. Life on Crete continued, but the Minoan way of organising the world quietly slipped out of focus. What followed was not absence, but transformation. The Mycenaeans inherited their roots, their buildings, their religious ideas, even their sense of the sea. Later Greeks inherited something more abstract, a memory of power without understanding its shape. Over time, that memory hardened into myth. Kings replaced administrators, monsters replaced systems. The palace became a labyrinth, and history became legend. Atlantis was never a place you could find on a map. It was a feeling, the sense that something advanced, balanced, and powerful had existed once and had been lost to forces beyond control. In that sense, the Minoans never truly vanished. They became a warning, a longing, and a question that refused to settle. Archaeology has brought us closer to the truth, but not close enough to hear their voices. We can reconstruct their homes, their art, their trade, and their disasters, but not their words. Their language remains silent, and perhaps that silence is intentional. The Minoans did not build their civilization to be remembered. They built it to work. They trusted systems over rulers, cooperation over conquest, movement over permanence. They ruled the sea without claiming it, organised society without crowns, and shaped the ancient Mediterranean without ever announcing themselves as masters of it. When the world changed, through disaster, instability, and rising militarization, their model no longer fit, and so it dissolved, not in failure, but in transition. Yet their legacy is everywhere, in the way the sea connects rather than divides, in the idea that power does not always need walls, in the reminder that some of the most influential civilizations leave behind the fewest words. The Minoans are gone, but they are not forgotten. They remain in ruins warmed by the sun, in myths whispered across centuries, and in the unanswered silence of a language that once kept an island alive. And perhaps that is their final lesson, that history is not always written by those who shout the loudest, but sometimes by those who move quietly, build carefully, and leave behind just enough mystery for us to keep listening. Thank you for watching Who Were the Minoans?